Just let me hear some of that rock and roll music, any old way you choose it.
Hello, this is Katie with Vintage and Vinyl, and I'll be spinning some rockin' 50s records every week here on my channel, as well as sharing some cool Coca-Cola collectibles and other neat vintage finds. Stay tuned! Hey guys, this is Katie with Vintage and Vinyl, back with another great video for you today. In this video, I am continuing my read of this 1953 saucy romance novel by Lois Hobert. I hope you guys have been enjoying this book as much as I have. I think it's so much fun. The story's coming along, and I have so many questions and things that I want to find out. So, before we get to chapter 3, I wanted to just take a minute and talk a little bit about the live sales that have been happening on YouTube. Not just live sales, but other great YouTube live events. So if you are not familiar with the calendar, you really should be. It's circulating Instagram on a variety of Instagram accounts, various YouTubers, and it is on mine, so I will link it down below. But Corey the Thrifted Artist is the one who makes the calendars, and she takes the time out of her busy schedule to make those just sort of out of the goodness of her heart. And to be honest, I rely on the calendar every week because there is so much going on here on YouTube, so many new wonderful channels popping up doing lives and hosting different events that it's really nice to have everything all in one place. So this week there's a lot of great events coming up that you definitely want to check the calendar for, and try if you can to go support as many people as you can. And even if you can't buy something or something's not your style, come hang out with us in the chat. There's so many wonderful comments and banter and jokes and things that get thrown around. It's just fun, and you don't want to miss that. So, live sale calendar on my Instagram. And another little quick note here is I wanted to apologize for my misspelling of the word beautiful. I realized I did not spell that correctly on my little intro card. I think that's what they're called, but the little screen that you see when you log on to my YouTube page, it was known by me, and I did fix it. My mom is an English major, so I really need to do a little bit better job at spell checking things before they go out the door. But I use Photoshop, and sometimes working with Photoshop and little video title cards are tiny and they're a little bit hard to see. But I got that fixed, and we will move on from that. So let's jump into Katie and her camera. Now, if you didn't hear last week's reading, chapter 2 is up on my YouTube page, so you can go watch that before you watch this video. But I'll give you a quick little recap. We met some very interesting characters. We had Katie, of course, and then her brother Kenny and her mother, and they are all suffering from the loss of their father and husband, so there's a lot going on there. And then we met a very interesting acquaintance. Her name's Diana Caldwell, and she seems very mischievous. She's been thrown out of a lot of colleges, and her father is unhappy because all she ever does is hang out with boys instead of go to class. So we have her. She's very, very interesting. And then we met Mr. Paul Serrell from the Herald. Now, he's a very important man. He's the local photojournalist and writer for the Herald newspaper, and he's very good at it. And then, of course, we had Mr. Esperon, who hired Katie. So we've got some great developments here, and I can't wait to see what happens in chapter 3. So let's jump in. Chapter 3, Consolation Prize. Katie was doodling black line triangles, cubes, and squares around her scant notes on Othello and Iago. Dismal, dreary, drizzling day, and her hair was straggling down in the dampness. She had slept badly, and sleeping dreamed about legions of Louises and Dianas and phantom men appearing and vanishing in the distance. And then she was marching alone over mountains of tennis rackets and bowling balls and trying to climb cliffs marked in squares like a chessboard. She had wakened to hear her mother crying in the next room and hadn't been able to go in and comfort her. Then, at breakfast, Kenny had spilled coffee over her best tweed skirt. She had half a mind to telephone Mr. Esperon that she had a headache and wouldn't be in until Monday. She couldn't bear the thought of facing him. He had no business getting so personal and probing into her private life. She hadn't invited any advice and didn't see why he should butt in like that. Besides, what was so terrible about preferring her girlfriends to most of the boys she knew? They were such gawks, most of them. Either they were terrific at sports and didn't know the first thing about music or books, or they were poetry spouters and chess fiends, but utter flops at tennis or bowling or swimming. They were always trying to hold hands or kiss her when she wasn't interested. And Katie didn't want to be bothered with such nonsense, and it was awkward about fending them off. If they would only settle for friendly companionship, if they were more versatile, interested in something besides baseball, football, or campus politics. Stan Levens, for instance, had a whacking good serve and a backhand drive, and was a Phi Beta Kappa. But then again, he was Louise's territory. Anyhow, Katie didn't miss men. If she wanted to see a movie or play or go bowling, she'd merely call a girlfriend and they'd have a good time without any complications. So, why worry about men? When the bell sounded, Katie sat with her feet propped in a chair in front of her, staring glumly at her moccasins and twisting a lock of dark hair with her finger. She eyed the mud all over her shoes and just felt messy. Maybe she'd be better off quitting her job altogether and hunting up another one, but now that school had started, she really couldn't spare much time for looking, and part-time jobs were scarce. Other students were filtering in for the next class. Katie removed her feet from the chair in front of her, collected her books, and edged her way out. In the cafeteria of Kaufman Memorial Union, she ignored some acquaintances and sat alone at a table, eating a tuna fish sandwich. There was Diana Caldwell at a window table with two handsome men, naturally. Katie opened her Minnesota Daily to read while she lunched. When she glanced again in Diana's direction, a third man had stopped at her table. Katie saw only his back, but something about him struck her as out of place. It's not the crew cut, certainly. His suit, she supposed. It was a blue, a shade on the sharp side. Hardly regulation campus garb. The other two men were scowling at the newcomer, and Diana's face, which usually featured indifference, had grown impassive. Not a friendly reception, it seemed. The man shrugged his shoulders and left abruptly, passing Katie's table as she pushed her chair back to leave. Her glimpse of him was brief, but it reinforced her swift impression of someone who was out of key with the campus. He was a smallish man, neutral in coloring, not very noticeable in a way. His features weren't bad, and he might have almost been good-looking, but the downward thrust of a thin mouth gave him an unpleasant twist to his face. Diana clearly was not impressed with him either. Katie stood in front of Esperon's door half an hour later with the key in her hand, unwilling to enter and yet uncertain why she had not followed her earlier impulse to phone off and beg off from coming to work. Still resentful of Esperon's probing, she had no wish to face him and risk further analysis before she had even digested his other comments. In the middle of her resentment, a memory was stirring, which at first seemed unrelated. It was the day of last summer when she and Louise had been playing tennis while another couple waited for their court. One of the men had spoken to her afterwards about her game. He had complimented her on her drive and her serve, but warned her that she was using too much of a chop, and it was spoiling her game and throwing her off. And if she would just follow through a little more consistently, he illustrated what he meant by guiding her hand on the racket, she would be less erratic. At first, she had been a little hurt and annoyed, especially since he hadn't ventured no comments or criticism on Louise's play, but shortly after she learned that the man was a national public park champion and began to realize that he wouldn't have bothered to speak to her if her game hadn't been basically good enough to offer promise. Perhaps, she thought, a little mollified, Mr. Esperon wouldn't have troubled to talk to her that way either if he hadn't had felt she was worth criticizing. So she had better learn to take criticism and suggestions a little more in stride and not be overtensive about them. The outside door of the building slammed down below, and someone came whistling up the stairs. Katie finally unlocked the door and went in.
The grim skylight let in just enough of the gray daylight to make dusk in the room. Not even a lamp over the work table was turned on. There were no sounds from the dark room. She switched on the light and saw a note on her typewriter. Dear Katie, quick assignment, no time to prepare chemicals for darkroom work. Should be back in time to coach you if you will get things ready. Get a gallon container of Dectrol Developer in yellow can on right of second shelf and a gallon of hypo left on same shelf. Follow directions exactly and mix in 2 brown gallon bottles. Check carefully with a thermometer and you won't go wrong. That's a good girl, R.E. She read the note with mixed relief and disappointment. The whistler had stopped at the door and was knocking. Katie answered the door and found Paul Serrell leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed. Daydreaming? He smiled, and she found herself reconsidering her appraisal of him as arrogant. Oh, I'm sorry I kept you waiting, but I just come in and was reading Mr. Esperon's notes of instructions. He's not in today. She wished he would go away this time and not wait around. She was in no mood to make polite conversation. His words ended her prospects of solitude. Ralph phoned me. He said he'd be back soon and I should wait for him here. Oh, well, please come in then. She saw he was making himself at home as usual, so she started for the dark room. You don't wear your coat when you work, do you? Oh, in her eagerness to be alone, she had forgotten to take it off, and to her surprise, he came over to help her out of it. He looked at her and then, with a smile, hung his coat and hers in the closet. I see Ralph is keeping things a little neater around here since you started that cleanup campaign, he remarked. Yes, she said indifferently. He hired someone to clean things up in the mornings. Are things really so bad? He asked as she opened the darkroom door. What things? She said, mystified. Oh, whatever makes you look so glum. You look set for an execution. Ralph mentioned he was starting you on darkroom work today, but it's not much of an ordeal, you know. It's not all that, she said, and she pointedly turned her back again. Amen, it's none of my business, he deduced cheerfully. You're quite one for keeping things to yourself, aren't you? Unwrapping an ostrich tobacco pouch, he filled his pipe, lit, and drew on it, watching Katie. Katie was abashed by her own discordsy and quickly apologized. I'm awfully sorry, Mr. Serrell. I'm not usually rude. It's just been one of those perfectly wretched days, and Mr. Esperon wants me to prepare his chemicals, and I'm jittery because I've never done it before. He sat on the edge of the couch and squinted at her through the gray pipe haze. Are you sure that's all? I have a hunch Ralph has been up to his old tricks again. He pointed his pipe stem at her in challenge. He's been telling you off, hasn't he? Katie's ears tightened with embarrassment, and she knew she was blushing again. How did you know? What do you mean, old tricks? I know Ralph. He's the kind of guy who's impatient with small talk and hates polite barriers. He likes to get down to fundamentals right away, and he forgets that other people aren't used to his direct approach and that he can do some damage when he's not careful. He pulled the same stunt with me the day we met. It threw me for a while. I wouldn't speak to him beyond the call of duty. We were on assignment together, and then I took an objective look at myself and decided the old boy was right. It was interesting that even Paul Serrell was vulnerable and could be discomforted. What did he think was wrong with you? Katie asked with prompt curiosity. He shook his head. Oh, no, you don't. We're not getting sidetracked on me. Once you get a man started on self-analysis, you better forget about work altogether for a while. You're the subject of this discussion. Let's have it. What did he tell you? Here. He pulled out a chair for her. I had a suspicion that this call smacked of an SOS. He was afraid he'd been too rough and wanted to pull the chestnuts out of the fire for him. All right, what did he say? Well, I should be working, she began helplessly. It was like being a schoolgirl again in the principal's office. He blandly ignored her protest and waited for her account with an air of judicial interest which demanded compliance. Katie gave up. Well, essentially it was the reason I don't go out very much, and that I'm too choosy about the boys I know, and not a mature enough person to appeal to the kind of man who would interest me. Also not aggressive enough. He thinks I'm adopting a sour grapes attitude, and won't bother with men at all because I can't have the kind I want. Do you think he's right? He was so objective and serious in a manner that Katie tried to respond with equal detachment in her reply. She considered. Well, I can see how that might develop, but honestly I don't think he's right. In the first place, I'm rather reserved and have never gotten very excited about a man very easily. In the second place, there are so many things happening in my life, so much I want to learn about, so many people to meet, so much to do, and I'm not searching for other complications. Besides, I have the feeling that there's plenty of time. I'm not in a hurry, and I'd like to know myself a little bit better before I get seriously interested in anyone. Maybe the truth is that I'm not ripe enough yet. I suppose he's right about that. Uh-huh. You do want to get married someday? Yes, I suppose so. I hadn't really thought much about it, though. I mean, it's the sort of thing that goes along with falling in love and finding the right kind of person, don't you think? So why think about it? What meaning does it have unless you know someone you want to marry? Sounds logical to me. Did you say any of this to Ralph? Oh, no. I was too taken aback by the whole thing. It came up so suddenly. Why do you think you've never gotten very excited about a man? I don't know, maybe some sort of defense mechanism, a fear of being hurt, who knows? Probably I'd go overboard since I did get interested, and I want to make sure I'm not wasting time with the wrong person for me before I let myself go all out, you know? Well, it's more cautious than romantic, I'll say that. You seem to have things well pretty figured out, though. Was that all Ralph said? Oh, no. He hinted at other things. He thought my mother might be influencing me by setting too high expectations and standards, disapproving of my boyfriends, but I don't believe that. I think she'd be delighted, for instance, if I fell in love with Mike, but she's never... Who's Mike? He's the boy next door. We were together a lot during high school and dated quite a bit, and always had a good time together, but I can't imagine getting excited about him. We studied together a lot, listened to records, and went to parties and all that, but we're just friends all along. You still see him? Oh yes, he's always been a part of our family affairs, but he's studying music and wants to be a concert pianist, and I've been busy, so except for a concert now and then, we never have dates anymore. But what really annoyed me, Mr. Serrell, was that Mr. Esperon thought all about my friends. He has this idea that they're all alike and all proper and all prissy, but they're really not. They're good company and fun to be with, and until I do get interested in someone special, I'd rather just call up a girlfriend and say, let's go to a movie, than wait around for a date to call. And even if we are too much of a kind, I'm beginning to know some quite different types. There's a girl from Connecticut who's completely different from anyone else I know. Very chic and sophisticated, anything but intellectual. I see. Item 1. The main thing is that you're taking Rolf's chatter in stride and thinking it out for yourself, not automatically either disregarding it or taking it too much to heart. Item 2. Do you need any help in the darkroom? I used to do some photographic work myself when I worked on a small town paper. Before Katie could open her mouth, he was in the darkroom, pulling down trays, cans, beakers, thermometers, and giving her directions about measuring water, checking temperatures, and mixing chemicals. Keep stirring until the chemicals are dissolved. When that's done, set up these 16 by 20 trays with the tray marked developer nearest the enlarger. Then a tray for clear water. Some people add a touch of acetic acid, and then a tray for hypo. Now, you're started, and I can't wait any longer for Ralph. Tell him I'll call him tonight. A grin stretched across his face as if they shared a particularly good secret joke. And I'll tell him that I didn't need to send out an SOS after all. Say, get yourself a denim apron or skirt so you won't splash up your clothes. Ralph would never think of telling you that. Any questions? All right, I'll see you again soon. He went out with his coat slung jauntily over his shoulder. Man with a mission accomplished, Katie thought wryly, stirring the developer. But what a nice person he turned out to be. She certainly had never expected to pour out such intimacies to him. She measured out a beaker of fresh developer, added 2 beakers of cold water to the tray, and set up other trays as she was directed. When Esperon came in, looking like a faintly apprehensive burglar, she was sitting on the floor, cross-legged, tailor fashion, surrounded by photographic books. She glanced up with an impish smile. Hello, Mr. Searle said to tell you he would phone you tonight, and that he said you didn't need to send out for any more SOSs. He exploded into a shout of relieved laughter. That double-crossing son of a gun! Good girl, Katie. Now let's get to work. He shed his coat and camera equipment and any worries he might have had about Katie's state of mind. She stood by the enlarger while Esperon inserted a strip of negative and explained each step. These are Rolleiflex negatives, 2 1/4 inches square, so we use this holder. He put one in, shiny side up, upside down in the holder, and turned on the enlarger light to focus. That looks sharp. Now, bring over that box of 8x10 Vingram tea, please. We insert a sheet of paper into this 8x10 easel, and then we'll try a 10-second exposure at f8. On went the light and off again. He dipped the paper in the first tray and showed Katie how to swish it around, rocking the tray gently, lifting the paper to the air to hasten development, and dipping it down again while little splotches of gray and black appeared mysteriously in the feeble glimmer of the safe light. After another minute in the developer to deepen the blacks, he transferred it to the next tray for a rinse, and then began to the hypo tray to bleach out the yellowish tones and fix the print. Then he examined it under white light. A good print. You can try the next negative and see what you can do. Katie shifted a second negative in the strip of 4 into a placeholder, focused, and went through the same process with the paper, now and then questioning it by look. Eagerly, she watched the emergence of light and shade and form in the developing tray. Then, in suspense, she waited for the hypo to clear off before she turned on the white light for inspection. Too gray a print, said Esperon over her shoulder. Could have had 2 seconds longer in the enlarger, and you pulled it too soon from the developer. You mustn't be over-eager or you'll spoil your prints. Your timing will improve with experience. It might help you to use this timing gadget, too. She made a better print on the second try, and he showed her how to make a test strip with 1 negative by exposing 1 section of the paper at a time at regular intervals so that she could study the results and choose the best time. She could see how the pale blacks were in the first section and how dark the highlights were in the last, how rich the contrast was between the dark and the light in the middle section. He explained that with most of his negatives, he could use the same timing because he habitually controlled the exposures to produce a slightly thin negative, and he preferred to work with that. But there will always be some conditions you can't control, Katie, he told her. You have to learn how to handle all kinds of negatives, dense or thin, contrast or gray, to bring out the best color possible. With a lot of experience, you may be able to judge a negative by looking at it, but in a pinch you'll always find a test strip wise and a good method to follow. You're bound to have a lot of difficult negatives in the beginning. It was nearly 6, and Katie would be late for dinner, but she hated to leave. Take along any of those books you want to borrow, Esperon offered, and if you'd like to bring me any of your snapshots, I'd love to look them over. Well, guys, that is the end of chapter 3 of Katie and her camera. I hope you guys enjoyed this reading. I think there's a lot of fun developments. I kind of think that Katie's falling for Mr. Searle. That's going to be a very interesting relationship if that happens. So we'll have to see. And I kind of think that the third man that came over to her table, Katie's new acquaintance, Diana Caldwell, I kind of think that might have been her father. She might have had some issues with him because she wasn't doing what she was supposed to. But we'll see how that goes in chapter 4. So I hope you guys will support everybody this week. Watch the live sales, live events, tune in to everything you can. And please, most importantly, stay in, stay safe, and binge YouTube.
That's why I go for that rock and roll music. Any